It begins with a memory 80 years ago when the world was still trembling from the ruins of the Second World War. Nations gathered scarred and desperate, and they placed their hope in one new institution, the United Nations. It was meant to be the shield against war, the voice for the voiceless, the bridge toward fairness and peace. For a time, it seemed to work. But today, under the bright lights of New York, a painful truth can no longer be hidden. 54 African nations, 1/4 of humanity, remain on the margins of the very system they helped sustain. The words spoken at the UN's 80th anniversary cut like thunder. You cannot claim to be the United Nations while disregarding the voice of 54 nations. That line did not just echo through the Assembly Hall, it struck at the very soul of global governance. For 2 decades, Africa has spoken in one voice, demanding justice, equity, and representation. Yet the answer has been silence, delays, and endless excuses. Think about it. How can an institution call itself united when entire continents are excluded from its most powerful table? How can it still claim moral authority while crises in Gaza, Sudan, and the Sahel rage on without decisive action? These are not questions for Africa alone. They are questions for the United States, for Europe, for every citizen who once believed that the UN was humanity's best hope. So here is the real challenge. Will the United Nations reform to reflect the world of today, or will it collapse into irrelevance like the League of Nations before it? And for us watching from afar, do we still trust this system? Or do we believe leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso when they say Africa must build its own path? Please share your thoughts below if you believe Africa's voice must finally be heard. And subscribe if you believe the truth matters more than the headlines. The 80th anniversary of the United Nations was supposed to be a celebration, a proud reminder of how far humanity had come since the rubble of World War II. Yet instead of joy, the air was thick with unease. Delegates filled the Grand Hall in New York, diplomats adjusting their ties, heads of state waiting for carefully scripted speeches. And then came words that shook the silence, words that no one could ignore. For 2 decades, Africa has spoken in one voice, demanding justice, equity, and representation, and yet the world has chosen not to listen. This was not just rhetoric, it was history speaking back. For 20 years, Africa has put forward a clear and united demand reform of the United Nations Security Council. The Esselwini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration, the official positions of the African Union, are not vague statements but firm proposals. Africa wants and deserves at least 2 permanent seats with full rights, including the power of veto and 2 additional non-permanent seats. Nothing less. Why? Because Africa is not just a passive observer of global crises. It is the very heart of the UN's agenda. More than half of Security Council discussions involve African conflicts. African soldiers make up some of the largest contingents of UN peacekeepers, putting their lives on the line in distant countries far from their own homes. From Somalia to the Democratic Republic of Congo, from Sudan to Mali, African troops wear the blue helmets. And yet, when it comes time to decide the fate of these missions, Africa has no permanent voice in the room. This is the contradiction at the center of today's global order. An institution created to represent all humanity has systematically excluded one of the world's most vital regions. To many in the global south, this is not only unfair, it is dangerous. Without legitimacy, without representation, even the most noble institutions lose their power. That is the lesson of the League of Nations, a body that collapsed not because its ideals were wrong, but because it refused to adapt. When Japan invaded Manchuria, when Italy marched into Ethiopia, when Hitler defied its rules, the League of Nations stood by paralyzed. By 1945, it was irrelevant. And in its place, the UN was born. But 8 decades later, the same warning signs are flashing. The Security Council is frozen in 1945, a relic of the Second World War still dominated by the same 5 permanent members: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. Africa, the continent with the youngest population, vast resources, and some of the most pressing crises, remains voiceless. As one African leader put it, you cannot call it the United Nations when Africa is absent from the permanent table. The frustration does not end with politics. It extends to economics. During the IMF's most recent allocation of special drawing rights, a lifeline designed to provide liquidity to countries in crisis, wealthy nations that did not even need the funds received 64% of the total. Meanwhile, poorer countries, many in Africa, were left with just 2.4%. The message was unmistakable. The system rewards the rich, punishes the poor, and calls it fairness. And so the African Union has begun to take matters into its own hands. With boldness and clarity, it is championing new institutions, the African Central Bank to issue a single continental currency and free trade from dependence on the US dollar or the euro, the African Monetary Fund to stabilize economies and give financial sovereignty back to the continent, the African Investment Bank to mobilize resources for infrastructure industrialization and integration, and most recently, the African Credit Rating Agency to evaluate African nations on their own terms rather than through the biased lens of Western agencies. These are not dreams. These are concrete steps toward independence, and they signal something the world can no longer ignore. If the United Nations continues to stall, Africa is prepared to build its own future inside or outside the system. At the heart of the UN's 80th anniversary is therefore not celebration, but confrontation. The confrontation between ideals and reality, between promises and betrayals, between the world as it was in 1945 and the world as it is today. And in that confrontation, one truth rises above all: Africa will not wait forever. The air inside the United Nations hall grew heavier as the speech built toward its breaking point. Diplomatic courtesies fell away, replaced by a raw, unfiltered truth. Africa is no longer willing to wait on the margins of global governance. The sentence rang out not just as a demand, but as an ultimatum. For decades, patient negotiations had been met with silence. Now came the warning: if the UN does not reform, it risks collapsing into irrelevance. This was the moment of climax, the point where history pressed against the walls of the General Assembly. The speaker laid it out clearly. Africa demands 2 permanent seats on the Security Council, complete with veto power, and 2 additional non-permanent seats. Anything less would be a betrayal. This was not a polite request. It was the red line. The room shifted. Some delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, sensing that something historic was unfolding. For too long, Africa's absence from the highest levels of decision-making had been treated as a minor inconvenience. But here, before the eyes of the world, it was framed as a threat to the very survival of the UN. Reform was no longer charity, it was survival. And to prove the point, the speech invoked powerful evidence. Haiti became the living example. Kenya had stepped forward to lead a multinational support mission in Port-au-Prince with only a fraction of the resources and manpower promised. Against all odds, their officers restored order to government buildings, reopened schools, and forced gangs from the streets. The question was thrown back at the Assembly. If so much could be achieved with limited resources, what more could have been accomplished if the United Nations had truly acted together in solidarity? It was a haunting question, one that cut to the core of the UN's credibility. How many more crises had been allowed to spiral because the world hesitated, divided by rivalries and vetoes? Gaza, Sudan, the Sahel. Again and again, the UN's voice had been drowned out by great power politics. The blue helmets, once a proud symbol of peace, no longer commanded respect in the same way. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some African delegations erupted in applause, their hands echoing like drums of defiance. For them, this was long overdue, the moment the continent demanded what had been denied for generations. Delegates from Latin America and Asia nodded in solidarity, recognizing in Africa's voice their own struggles for representation. They too had felt the weight of decisions made in rooms where their voices did not count. But from the seats of the permanent members, the atmosphere was far more tense. Diplomats from the United States, France, and the United Kingdom exchanged stiff glances. Everyone knew what was at stake. Giving Africa a permanent voice meant diluting their own power. It meant admitting that the post-war order of 1945 had run its course. And it meant rewriting rules they had long taken for granted. The clash of perspectives was stark. On one side, the Global South demanding equity, representation, and justice. On the other, the old guard reluctant to loosen their grip. Yet the momentum was shifting. For the first time in decades, the possibility of a global realignment no longer seemed distant. It was being demanded loudly and publicly in the most important hall of diplomacy. The climax of the speech did not end with polite diplomacy. It ended with a challenge. Reforming the Security Council is not a favor to Africa. It is a necessity for the United Nations' own survival. That line struck with the weight of prophecy. The UN had been warned. The choice was clear: adapt to today's realities or join the League of Nations in the graveyard of failed institutions. And in that moment, something changed. The anniversary celebration transformed into a reckoning. Delegates who came expecting nostalgia instead instead faced the sharp edge of history. The world could no longer pretend that Africa's demand was just another resolution to be filed away. The time for polite waiting was over. When the applause faded and the speeches ended, the real question lingered. What happens if the United Nations continues to ignore Africa's voice? The answer is not abstract. It is already unfolding on the ground. The first consequence is erosion of legitimacy. For ordinary Africans, the UN is no longer seen as a neutral guardian of peace, but as a club of powerful nations protecting their own interests. In the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, young people ask a blunt question: why should we trust an institution that denies us representation yet sends peacekeepers to our soil? For them, the UN is drifting dangerously close to the fate of the League of Nations, a body that looked important on paper but meant little in reality. The second consequence is political backlash. Leaders across Africa, from Nairobi to Dakar, are increasingly framing the UN's resistance to reform as proof of global hypocrisy. How can the West preach democracy abroad while clinging to a Security Council frozen in 1945? This contradiction fuels nationalist movements, strengthens anti-colonial rhetoric, and gives legitimacy to leaders who argue, like President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, that Africa must stop waiting for fairness from others and instead seize its own destiny. The third consequence is civil frustration and rising radicalism. In fragile states like Sudan, Somalia, or the Sahel, citizens are watching international bodies hesitate while their lives are torn apart by war. Each time the UN fails to act decisively, whether in Gaza, in Haiti, or in Africa itself, it feeds a dangerous narrative that the global system does not care about them. This disillusionment can push populations toward populist leaders, separatist movements, or even extremist groups promising dignity where the UN offers only bureaucracy. At the same time, Africa is no longer content to remain dependent. The African Union has already begun constructing an alternative architecture, a single African currency designed to end dependence on the dollar and euro, an African monetary fund to replace IMF bailouts with African-led financial stabilization, an African investment bank to finance roads, schools, and industries without foreign conditionalities, and the newly launched African Credit Rating Agency to tell Africa's story through African metrics rather than Western bias. Each of these institutions is more than technical reform. They are symbols of sovereignty, and every step they take reduces the moral authority of the UN and Bretton Woods institutions. If these projects succeed, millions of Africans will see firsthand that their future does not depend on the goodwill of New York, Washington, or Paris. The political ripple effects will not stop at Africa's borders. Already parts of Latin America and Asia are voicing the same frustrations. If Africa proves it can build its own path, other regions may follow. This could fragment the global system into parallel orders, one still tied to the old UN and IMF, and another built by the Global South. Such a split would not only weaken the UN, it could mark the beginning of a new era of multipolar governance. But for now, the clearest consequence is a loss of trust. For elderly villagers in Mali, for students in Ghana, for activists in Kenya, the UN no longer feels like a shield. And once trust is broken, legitimacy is nearly impossible to restore. The 80th anniversary was meant to celebrate unity. Instead, it revealed fractures too deep to ignore. Unless the UN changes course, its greatest achievement, global solidarity, may slip away, leaving behind only bitterness, disillusion, and the determination of Africa to walk forward alone. In Washington, the message from Africa landed with a sting. For American policymakers, the demand for 2 permanent African seats on the Security Council is more than a debate over fairness. It is a challenge to the very architecture of power. Since 1945, the United States has held its seat, its veto, and its unmatched influence at the UN as proof of its global leadership. To share that privilege with Africa would mean acknowledging that the world has changed and that America's grip on the levers of international governance is no longer absolute. On Capitol Hill, the reactions split sharply. Some lawmakers, particularly those aligned with global justice movements, recognized Africa's claim as undeniable. They pointed to the hypocrisy of preaching democracy while upholding an undemocratic Security Council structure. Others, however, bristled at the idea. On conservative talk shows, commentators warned that granting Africa veto power would hand influence to Moscow and Beijing through their allies. For them, the African demand was not about justice, but about geopolitics, a battlefield where the U.S. risks losing control. Across the Atlantic, Europe faced its own reckoning. France and the United Kingdom, both permanent members, were put in an uncomfortable spotlight. Their colonial pasts in Africa still haunt them, and the notion of sharing equal power with former colonies exposes an old wound. In Paris, analysts quietly admitted that resistance to African seats would further erode France's already fragile credibility in West Africa, where leaders like Ibrahim Traoré have expelled French troops and denounced Paris as a relic of empire. In London, debates circled around whether clinging to post-war privileges would only accelerate Britain's decline on the global stage. Elsewhere, the Global South rallied. In Brazil, in India, in Mexico, voices grew louder in support of Africa's demand. They saw in it a mirror of their own frustrations, decisions made about their futures without their consent. Leaders across Asia and Latin America warned that if the UN does not evolve, the world will inevitably build new institutions to replace it. BRICS expansion, regional banks, and South-South trade deals were cited as evidence that alternatives are already taking shape. For Russia and China, Africa's push was an opportunity. Both nations positioned themselves as champions of reform, eager to present themselves as allies of the marginalized. Moscow spoke of historic justice, while Beijing framed Africa's claim as a natural step toward a multipolar order. Yet their motives were not purely altruistic. By supporting Africa's call, they also chipped away at Western dominance, turning reform into another front in the great power competition. For the United States, the question now looms large: can it afford to resist Africa's demand without undermining the very legitimacy of the UN it helped create? If Washington continues to say no, it risks being seen not as a leader of democracy, but as a defender of privilege. And for ordinary Americans, many of them veterans who fought under the UN flag or retirees who still remember the hope of 1945, the contradiction is hard to swallow. The world is watching. Africa's demand is no longer a whisper on the sidelines. It is a roar at the center of global diplomacy. How America, Europe, and the rest of the world respond will determine not just the fate of the UN, but the future of global governance itself. The 80th anniversary of the United Nations was meant to be a commemoration. Instead, it became a mirror, forcing the world to look at what the institution has become. The founding promise of We the Peoples was supposed to guarantee fairness, inclusion, and dignity. Yet, as Africa reminded the world, the UN risks drifting into irrelevance, repeating the tragic collapse of the League of Nations. Institutions do not die because their ideals are wrong. They die because they fail to change. This is no longer just Africa's struggle. It is a warning to all of us. When the Security Council ignores the pleas of Gaza, when it hesitates in Sudan, when it fails to protect Haiti, it is not only Africans who lose faith, it is humanity as a whole. Without legitimacy, the UN cannot hold back the storms of war, nor coordinate against pandemics, nor mobilize against climate collapse. And once trust is broken, it is nearly impossible to restore. Africa has made its position clear: reform is no longer optional. Leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso are not waiting for charity. They are building their own institutions, banks, funds, rating agencies that reflect Africa's sovereignty and dignity. If the UN refuses to adapt, the continent will continue to chart its own course, and others, Latin America, Asia, even disillusioned citizens in the West, may follow. That could mean the end of global solidarity as we know it. So the question is this: will the United Nations reform and rise to meet today's world, or will it cling to the past until it becomes irrelevant? And for us watching from America, can we still claim to defend democracy if we deny 54 nations a rightful place at the table? These are not questions for diplomats alone, they are questions for each of us. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré is right when he says Africa must no longer wait? Or do you still believe the UN can be saved from itself? Please share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe that truth must be told, even when it is uncomfortable, subscribe and stand with us. Because history is being written now, and silence is no longer an option.